placer que ustedes estén con nosotros en esta que es la quinta conferencia en línea para el evento un poco fantasmal por pandemia. Algún día vamos a hacer el evento en sí, que se llama Antropología en sus límites, terceros, espacios, que sería la segunda iteración de un congreso que hemos estado realizando en los últimos años sobre las relaciones entre la antropología y otros espacios, nuevos saberes, nuevas metodologías, distintas formas de pensar nuestro quehacer disciplinar y metadisciplinar e interdisciplinar, etc. Me da muchísimo gusto el día de hoy comentar que el tema de la conferencia Refugiados y terceros espacios, organización para una vida digna, o Refugees and Third Space Citizenship, Identity and Labor, que nos va a presentar Eliabeth Dunn. Entonces le voy a dar la palabra a Stephanie Igor Ayora Díaz, que es organizador de este evento.
Muchas gracias. Welcome everybody to the session. I'm going to introduce you in Spanish now, then Anne will introduce you in English, and then you will give us your talk. So I'm moving now into Spanish. Bienvenidos, como les decía Anne, a nuestra quinta conferencia. Es para mí realmente un placer, es un honor presentar a la profesora Eliabeth Dunn, que es una antropóloga que tiene licenciatura de la Universidad de Rochester en Nueva York, maestría en la Universidad de Chicago, doctorado en la Universidad de Johns Hopkins. Su tesis doctoral se convirtió en su primer libro, Privatizando Polonia, Comida para bebés, grandes empresas y la reconstrucción del trabajo. Ese libro fue publicado en 2004 y en 2005 recibió los premios de los libros Orbis, que es un importante premio polaco para libros, y el Hewitt, que es un premio que se da a libros dedicados al lado oriental europeo. Actualmente es profesora de geografía en la Universidad de Indiana, en Bloomington. Durante los últimos 12 años, su trabajo se ha enfocado sobre la migración forzada en la República de Georgia, en la Unión Europea y en los Estados Unidos. Su libro más reciente, en inglés también, es Sin regreso a casa, campamentos humanitarios y el dolor del desplazamiento. Fue publicado en 2018 por la prensa de la Universidad de Cornell. Actualmente cuenta con financiamiento de la National Science Foundation para estudiar refugiados en la industria empacadora de carne en Colorado, en Estados Unidos. Es miembro del Comité Ejecutivo de Inmigración de Refugiados Exodus, que es una agencia de reasentamiento con financiamiento federal localizada en Indianápolis, y directora ejecutiva de la Red de Apoyo a Refugiados, una pequeña ONG localizada en Bloomington, Indiana. Su artículo en Science, Protección a Refugiados y Problemas de Reasentamiento, cuenta con más de 1 millón de suscriptores. Su trabajo de divulgación académica ha sido publicado, entre otras revistas, en el Boston Review y en Slate, y es para mí realmente un placer, creo para todos nosotros, tenerla en nuestro ciclo virtual de conferencias de Antropología Límite 2, terceros espacios. Muchas gracias a ustedes por su presencia en este congreso, en esta conferencia, que estoy seguro nos va a resultar muy interesante para todos y todas quienes estamos acá. Te paso la palabra, Anne, para que lo puedas presentar en inglés para quienes lo necesiten.
Pues muchas gracias, Igor. Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me also to introduce Professor Eliabeth C. Dunn, who trained as an anthropologist, obtaining her BA from the University of Rochester, New York, her master's from the University of Chicago, and her PhD in anthropology from Johns Hopkins University. Her PhD thesis became her first book, Privatizing Poland, Baby Food, Big Business, and the Remaking of Labor, published in 2004. This book was recipient of both the Orbis and Ed A. Hewitt Book Prizes. She is currently a professor of geography at Indiana University and Bloomington. For the last 12 years, her work has focused on forced migration in the Republic of Georgia, the European Union, and the United States. Her most recent book, No Path Home, Humanitarian Camps and the Grief of Displacement, was published in 2018 by Cornell University Press. She's currently funded by the National Science Foundation to study refugees in the meatpacking industry in Colorado, United States. She's a member of the Executive Board of Exodus Refugee Immigration, a federally funded resettlement agency in Indianapolis, Indiana, and the Executive Director of the Refugee Support Network, a small community NGO in Bloomington, Indiana. Her article from 2016 in Science, Refugee Protection and Resettlement Problems, has over 1 million subscribers. Among other places, her public scholarship on these topics has been published in the Boston Review and in Slate. Without further ado, it's a great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Eliabeth Dunn, who will speak to us on the topic of refugees and third space citizenship, identity, and race. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a very kind introduction, and I'm really glad to be here. I want to start out with a series of apologies. First of all, this is a very loose talk. It's a series of not fully connected ideas. So I see it less as a presentation of finished work than as an invitation for you all to jump in and help me. I'm in the middle of field work in Greeley, Colorado, which is the town I grew up in. And I started research here in June with mostly with Rohingya and Somali meatpacking employees, refugees who were resettled here primarily because of the draw of the meatpacking plant, which could offer them unskilled employment where you didn't need to speak English. So I'm very open to your thinkings and reworkings and suggestions. This is a very rough draft. I will also tell you that my original co-author, Shay Fridland, is my postdoctoral fellow. We're very lucky that she, in fact, received another postdoc. So we'll complete that one this year before starting the one with me. So I did this by myself, and Shay does not have any responsibility for anything I say. Okay, so as I mentioned, I began my work here with refugees in the meatpacking industry. Most of the refugees here in Greeley are Rohingya and Somali refugees, although at the meatpacking plant, there is also a very substantial number of Mexican immigrants. The use of refugees in the meatpacking plant actually was prompted in 2006 by a series of immigration raids by the US Immigration Service. So refugees have been brought in as competitors and as replacements for undocumented Mexican workers. Although now the plant also uses a high number of documented Mexican workers. One of the interesting problems that confronted me in fieldwork was how to find these people, because I cannot enter the meatpacking plant. Meatpackers are extremely sensitive to bad publicity in the first place. In the second place, the plant was shut down for nearly 2 weeks last year because it was a hotbed of COVID infection. And finally, it was later this year shut down because of a Russian ransomware attack. So they let in very, very few strangers. So that how am I going to find these meatpackers? And what I did instead was to begin volunteering at the Immigrant and Refugee Center of Northern Colorado, which is an NGO that teaches English for immigrants of all statuses and helps them navigate complex bureaucratic systems in the United States. As a part of my work, I began sitting in on a citizenship class. This class is designed to help people who've had green cards for at least 5 years become citizens by passing the US Customs and Immigration Service's citizenship interview, which is conducted as a live examination with an individual examiner. The process consists of 2 basic parts. The first is filling out this 20-page application called the N400, which includes a series of biographical questions centered on security issues, and I'll talk more about that. And then when they're called in for an interview, candidates have to pass an exam, which includes an assessment of their English language skills, as well as their eligibility for citizenship. And it also tests their civics knowledge by asking a selection of 100 questions, which are given to candidates in advance. So the course is mostly populated by workers from the JBS meatpacking plant, both male and female. The majority of them are Rohingya people who were expelled from Burma, some of them during the mass genocide of 2017, but many of them in earlier waves of genocide when they were denationalized by the Burmese government. There are also people from Somalia, Thailand, Djibouti, and other places. Overwhelmingly, they're trying to become citizens for a very pragmatic reason. In order to bring their families from the camps and cities where they're currently marooned into the United States, the refugee first has to become a citizen and then apply for family reunification visas. So most of them are trying to bring family, usually from Bangladesh. Sitting in on this class, I noticed a very, very strange phenomenon. The instructor would ask questions and then go from student to student asking them for answers. And the students would repeat the same answer over and over. So the instructor would say, Nazimuddin, why did you come to America? And Nazimuddin would say, to be free. Aisha, why did you come to America? And Aisha would say, to be free. Bame, why did you come to America? And Bame would say, to be free. This strange answer, which flattened the various and complicated reasons that people choose to immigrate as refugees, continued over and over as students rehearsed the questions that the USCIS interviewer might ask. The instructor would read a question and put the answer on the screen, and then the students, one by one, would read and repeat the answer, carefully attempting to memorize it. And this was true for all parts of the exam. So students memorized their answers to biographic and demographic data. For example, have you used any other name since birth? And they would all repeat identically, no, I have not used any other name since birth. Students then memorized answers to the 100 historical and civics questions. Name one war that the United States fought in the 19th century. And they would all answer the Civil War. Have you ever, this is my favorite question, have you ever been a member of or in any way associated either directly or indirectly with the Communist Party? And they would all answer no. Or more complex questions even. This is another one of my favorite. I will say that I am the oldest person in the room and I was born in 1968. So this question gets asked, between March 23, 1933 and May 8, 1945, did you work for or associate in any way, either directly or indirectly, with any German, Nazi, or SS military unit, paramilitary unit, self-defense unit, vigilante unit, citizen unit, police unit, government agency or office, extermination camp, concentration camp, prisoner of war camp, prison, labor camp, or transit camp? And people are expected to have an answer ready for this very linguistically complex question. Similarly, they are asked if they've ever been a member of or ever served in, helped, or otherwise participate in any of the following groups: military unit, paramilitary unit, police unit, self-defense unit, rebel group, guerrilla group, militia, or insurgent organization. Again, these are all politically complex questions as well as linguistically complex ones, to which the people in the class, the students in the class, responded with highly flattened, memorized, rote answers. They even memorized the answers to the questions that the USCIS examiners would use to determine if they'd memorized the questions. So the examiners will ask the definition of terms to ensure that the applicant understands what they're answering. So for example, if the question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? The examiner might then ask, what's communism? If he asked, have you ever been involved with forcing or trying to force someone to have any kind of sexual contact or relation, and the refugee said no, then the examiner might respond with, what are forced sexual relations? Every student memorizes the same answer to the question to see if they've memorized the first answer, which is saying, they'll say something like, forced sexual relations are having sex with someone who does not want to. And they will repeat this answer absolutely verbatim, one by one. I was completely fascinated by this process. Why was there so much emphasis on memorizing the answers exactly as they were worded? How much of what they were saying did the refugees actually understand? And if they understood any of it, what did they make of it? These questions became increasingly important to me as I began to link what I was seeing in citizenship class to the larger questions I had come to investigate. One of our goals was to understand why the meatpacking industry relies on racialized non-citizen workers and to understand how labor markets for these kinds of workers are created. So my hunch was that the process I was seeing at the IRC was deeply related to the ways that refugees were constructed as non-citizens, potential citizens, or citizens of a particular kind, and to the ways that they were inserted in the local labor market and confined to particular niches in that labor market where low wage, unpleasant, and dangerous jobs are the norm. And indeed, meatpacking is the most dangerous job in America. It's a job that native-born white Americans generally refuse to do, even though the wages for this kind of work are higher than the prevailing wages for other kinds of unskilled work. The meatpacking plant is paying $26 an hour when the average wage the average wage for unskilled work in Greeley is about $15 an hour. So I asked these questions about memorizing pre-formulated answers. I asked what role this process plays in identity formation in third space. I asked how it affects the development of a racialized labor market. And then I started to think about how this entire process should make us rethink what third space is. So that's how I'm going to head through this talk. So let me begin by thinking about the Immigrant and Refugee Center as a third space. The simplest definition of third space is a public space that is neither home nor work. In that sense, the IRC is a third space. It's an NGO that is locally funded and located in the basement of an office complex that also has a low-income health clinic, an Asian American center, and various private businesses. The main space is dark and windowless. It's a core surrounded by classrooms that are also largely dim and windowless. It has the soulless feel of a corporate office combined with that built on a shoestring feeling of an underfunded NGO. And people from all over the world drift through it. Somali women trailing knee-length hijabs, Rohingya men in t-shirts with the meatpacking plant logo on them, Mexican women chatting with each other, and so on. So it's quite a lively space. Before the pandemic, many people came here 4 times a week for language lessons, for citizenship classes, and just to hang out. The center provides childcare while people are in class, so it's popular with both men and women. And the classes are designed to accommodate people who work both first shift at the meatpacking plant, which is largely staffed by Mexican immigrants, and the second shift, which is largely staffed by Rohingya and Somali people. So these are people who are coming to class at 8:30 in the morning, staying until 1 p.m., going from there to a 2 o'clock shift at the meatpacking plant, where they work until 2 o'clock in the morning most days. And then they get up 5 hours later and repeat the entire process. The place is run by a combination of professional staff employed by the IRC, most of whom are politically left-leaning, some very left-leaning, and a team of what I call the renegade librarians, people employed by the local public library who have gone far beyond books to provide everything from coaching for the citizenship exam to finding children's books in Burmese to handing out diapers, which they do at every event because it brings so many people in. Everybody at the IRC is intensely committed to integrating refugees into what otherwise is an intensely right-wing Trump-supporting community. Nearly 58% of the voters in Weld County, where Greeley is located, voted for Donald Trump. And the local congressman, shown here with his automatic weapon, introduced legislation called the No Bailouts for Illegal Aliens Act, which would have prevented undocumented people from accessing social services. So this is a little island of cultural tolerance put together by people who are politically left inside this giant context of very strong right-leaning people in the United States. So here we have a third space that is not home, not work. But it is also a third space in the more complex sense that Homi Bhabha has discussed. That is, it opens up a third space that's not just a physical space, but an intersubjective, intercultural space where new identities can be negotiated. This space emerges between people of different cultures. It complicates essentialist, nationalist, and racialized identities, and it turns people into something they could not have been outside the intersection of different historical trajectories. Baba argues that the third space was integral to the colonial encounter because it allowed colonizers to constitute colonized subjects that they then could reject. That is not because those people were seen as inhuman or not human, but because they were defined in that process as a lesser kind of human. Yet for Baba, third space also is a place that offers the possibility of new hybrid identities that come with a potential of some kind of liberation. He says, third space is an in-between space which provides the terrain for elaborating strategies of selfhood, singular or communal, that initiate new signs of identity, and it produces innovative sites of collaboration and contestation. It is in the emergence of these interstices, the overlap and displacement of domains of difference, that the intersubjective and collective experiences of nationness, community interest, or cultural value are negotiated. This idea was intensely popular in the 1990s, and it was picked up to celebrate the neither nor identities of post-colonial subjects, particularly those who had migrated across space and who blended their place of origin with their new places of habitation, particularly in colonial metropoles. Indeed, I did a quick literature search on this and turned up hundreds of papers celebrating places just like the IRC. Places where people from a wide variety of cultures, including the dominant white Euro-American culture, could meet. Like these other spaces, the IRC is certainly a space where refugees can produce new hybridized identities. No longer simply Somali or Rohingya, if they ever were simply that. They are now intercultural travelers, people whose life experience is profoundly shaped by their intersubjective relations with teachers and staff, as well as with each other. These refugees appear here as cosmopolitans, as people who construct themselves from multiple cultural and historical vantage points. This third space, according to Baba, is thus a site where people a site that can be used as the standpoint from which to resist, dispute, and transgress power precisely because it's marginal. Standing at the edge, people can critique the center. The cosmopolitan hybrid subjects who emerge are people then who have a wide scope for constructing themselves. They have a great deal of autonomy for self-subjectification, even though they've been pushed to the political edges. But as much as Baba sees third space as the product of relations of power, he asks very little about how power shapes third space in the present. Seeing third space as intersubjective, he doesn't ask any questions about the constraints that institutions pose on who these subjects can become. Looking at refugees in the citizenship class, however, makes one thing painfully apparent. The state deliberately inserts itself into third space. Coming between the refugees and the humanitarian teachers who want to help them or save them, the state pushes teachers into acting against their own ideological principles. Mike, the teacher here who's second from the left in this photograph, told me once in a depressed voice, it's really hard to tell them that even if they work hard, even if they pass the exam, they're never going to really be citizens. I mean, they'll always be treated as if they're second class. He very often muttered to me these asides between loud, slow statements to the class. And in his asides to me, he expressed his disagreement with the statements he was forced to make in order to teach students to pass the exam. His comments focused on everything from the role of British colonialism in the oppression of the Rohingya to the changes in the exam answers under the Trump administration. And in having one voice for the students and another for me, he constantly underlined the fact that he himself was forced to become a split subject. On the one hand, he was a dissident, a critic of US empire, who wanted to encourage students to resist their unequal treatment and their second-class status. But on the other hand, he was continually forced into the position of representing the state, even though he was not in the employ of the state. So the state co-opts teachers like Mike in third space in order to politically indoctrinate students. There were few moments in the relations between staff and students that were not, in fact, colonized by the state. In almost every interaction, in every service the IRC offered, the problem of state bureaucracy appeared. And it wasn't just the citizenship classes. Language classes, for example, were constantly focused not on giving students the ability to survive everyday interactions in English, but were constantly aimed at helping them pass the language evaluation on the citizenship exam. Community navigators, or volunteers that spoke the refugees' languages, were acting as an interface between them and the state, helping them contend with state bureaucracies from food stamps to Medicaid to the school system. The entire enterprise was not aimed at resisting the state, but rather in helping refugees become competent and willing subjects to it. Baba makes the point that the subjects produced in third space are never fully assimilated. In being hybrid, he says they're always mimetic subjects. That is, they are close, but not quite replicas of the metropolitan colonists. Mike points this out too. He says that his students will never really be full citizens, even if they pass the exam. They will always be seen as inappropriate, as diverging from the standard, as poor copies of a proper white citizen. That is, what he is pointing out is what Baba points out. They're going to be Americanized, but they will never be American. As such, they become suitable subjects for a racially segmented labor market. They're proper subjects for jobs that are so degrading, so dangerous, so onerous that Americans refuse to do them, or that is, European Americans refuse to do them, even when wages are high. The almost but not quite citizen thus becomes the most useful of workers, someone who's legal to work, thus not incurring raids from the immigration authorities, but who is also capable of being injured, worked to the point of collapse, forced to contend with chemical exposures, cold and pandemic disease, and more. I want to talk briefly then about the language of citizenship. Before I assume that all the identities created in third space are oppressive, I want to think back for a second to this repeated scene where the refugees repeat answers verbatim that are provided to them. The language that they repeated had a strange quality, very stiff and polished, one that obscured their actual personalities or their opinions or their experiences. So why not have them, in fact, answer in their own words? If this is a project of political indoctrination, wouldn't it be better to have them express those ideas as if they were their own, rather than repeating kind of verbatim prepackaged statements? And why did the teachers and refugees respond to the USCIS examiners' attempts to make sure that the refugees understood what they were saying with, in fact, more phrases that had been memorized by rote? These rote phrases seem to create some kind of a blank wall around the refugees themselves, hiding their own selves and own beliefs from the scrutiny of the teachers or from USCIS. Far from seeing students expressing transgressive or oppositional beliefs in third space, we in fact see almost nothing. We can't know what they actually think at all. Couldn't this gap between the formulaic answers and the sense refugees made of them provide a kind of third space of its own, a protected space for their own understanding and dissent? Couldn't it create a shelter for the kind of identity formation that Baba describes? This is a question that resonated with me quite a lot because my previous work has all been in Eastern Europe, much of it in the former Soviet Union. And when I saw refugees reciting stock answers, the thing I immediately thought of was a Communist Party meeting, where an event where people speak in hegemonic language that's so formulaic that it's almost devoid of meaning. Speaking of Lenin as forever alive, for example, or talking about the unebbing significance of the victory of the working class, gave the language of the Communist Party what Russians called a frozen or wooden character, much like the language of refugees in the citizenship class. In a book called The Captive Mind, Czesław Miłosz, the Polish dissident, argued that the very formulaic character of that language opened up space for dissent. he drew an analogy with the Islamic concept of ketman, that is, the art of paying ideological lip service to ideological precepts while concealing one's own personal dissent. Is it possible that the very frozen nature of these answers to the USCIS exam open up a similar space, one in which refugees can actually formulate and then conceal opposition to political indoctrination? This is a question that haunted me as I watched these performances in the classroom. Before I start to unpack that, I will address the obvious question on the table, which is, do they even understand what they're saying? And the answer is that that's not very easy to say. There was one woman in the class who had a PhD from a university in Canada and who was very frustrated at the sort of lockdown nature of these answers. But there were other people who were monolingual only in Rohingya, who had zero formal education because when they were denationalized, they were pushed out of the education system. There was one man, a 75-year-old man, who I was teaching to hold a pencil. At the same time, he was being taught to memorize these answers, which he clearly understood none of. So this problem of comprehension is, of course, compounded by the obscure, dense language of government bureaucracy, which makes even simple questions into long sentences with multiple clauses, which sometimes even I struggle to unpack. But I think there is a spectrum of comprehension. But for those people who can control the language to some degree, the goal is very clear: to deploy preformed answers in response to preformed questions. And you can see that, let's see if I can show this. USCIS actually encourages this. They say here that although USCIS is aware that there may be additional correct answers to the civics questions, applicants are encouraged to respond to the questions using the answers already provided. So they want them to repeat the verbatim answer. This is then a process baked into the whole citizenship process from the very beginning. I was really struck by this because it reminded me so much of what Alexei Yurchak, the anthropologist who has written about the last Soviet generation, called techniques of block writing. In the Soviet Union, the people knew that the point of preparing an article or speech for party functions was to knit together blocks of pre-written text provided by the state itself. In the Komsomol, for example, because he was interviewing a lot of Komsomol youth party leaders, what they would do is pick out a published article provided by the state and then cut out little snippets of it, paste them down, and then write a speech around them so that the majority of what they were saying was using preformed language. And by the way, if you think this is an unusual process, you should look at American university students who are trained to do much the same thing in classes. The point here is not to convey semantic meaning. Yurchak tells us that in late socialism, the importance of meaning was vastly superseded by this emphasis on form. He calls this the semantic to pragmatic shift. The goal is not to convey any kind of referential meaning to the ideology for which the language is supposed to stand. It's not to express the ideas. It's in fact to refer to the discourse itself as politically situated activity. This, as he says, is an act of recognition of how one must behave in a given ritualistic context in order to reproduce one's status as a social actor, rather than an act conveying any literal meaning. In this sense, it's a response to the question, are you the kind of social actor who understands and acts according to the rules of the current ritual with its connection to the larger system of power relations? The USCIS exam, too, is about a shift from the semantic to the pragmatic. In mouthing the preformed replies, students are showing that they can perform appropriately as social actors, not necessarily that they believe what they're saying or that they're even telling the truth. This means the question of do they believe what they're saying is the wrong question altogether. As Yurchak tells us, to analyze this act only for its truth conditions, either as real support or as dissimulation of support, is to miss the point. So even though the USCIS exam is an act of indoctrination, it's not necessarily an act of compelling particular beliefs. Rather, it's an act of compelling particular performances, of pushing people to act in particular ways, in particular contexts, and to perform their citizenship on demand. So let me conclude with just a few sketchy final thoughts. Jurčák says something very interesting about the question of whether this third space is always opposition to domination. He doesn't use the concept of third space, but I'm applying it here. He says, first of all, the blocks of text that people say, their form is frozen, but their meaning can shift dramatically over time. And so what we see is a dynamic in which people can shift their interpretation as they go. He says the reproduction of form intersects with the reinterpretation of meaning, which means that people can make what they say mean different things at different times. He says, or the question then is, how do refugees reinterpret or recontextualize the forms they're being made to reproduce, giving them new meanings or new significances in context? What happens when they see contradictions between the frozen textual form and their lived experience? For example, when they hear all men are created equal, but experience their own inequality. Rather than turning refugees into dissidents, this may open up the space for a much wider scope of identity formation that includes the ability to hold contradictory opinions simultaneously. And Jurčák tells this great story about young Komsomol leaders who were forced on the one hand to repeat texts that condemned Western rock music, and on the other hand were writing texts of their own that they could recite when they were playing Western rock music at Komsomol parties. So both things being held in tension with each other. So do refugees do something like that? Do they separate the frozen language and the replication of form from concrete situations in ways that let them agree with the ideology that's being presented, even though they then believe something else in a different context when it contradicts their own experience? I see this, some of the hints of this are the fact that many of the refugees, once they are citizens and registered to vote, become Republicans. That is, they join the party that is anti-immigration and anti-worker. Because they very often become intensely nationalistic and intensely patriotic, even though that very ideology is aimed against them. At the same time, they will oppose the state when it conflicts with them in other cultural ways. So right now I'm working with refugees who have their children taken away by social services. And they're in conflict with child welfare authorities over culturally divergent beliefs of child rearing. And they don't see any contradiction between expressing patriotic ideology and coming into conflict with the state at this moment. What this means for my central question about how refugees interact in a racialized labor market that also discriminates on the basis of citizenship status is something that I'm going to continue thinking about. Can people think of themselves as Americans while interacting in a labor market that only wants them to be Americanized? How does the surrounding community contend with this gap between American subjects and Americanized subjects when it depends on these sort of Americanized subjects, but sort of foreign subjects for their labor power, which is basically the economic survival of a town that depends on a meatpacking plant? How do people think or rethink their hybrid identities as they come into contact with other kinds of state regulation that disadvantage them? Right now, for example, I'm working with a man who had his finger cut off at work in a horrible accident, which is stunningly frequent in this industry. And I'm watching him contend with the workers' compensation apparatus, which is half private, but controlled by government regulation. And his frustration about his inability to negotiate with his boss or with the insurance company, because what they do is prescribed by law. Does that frustration make him rethink his own views of American patriotism? These are all questions I'm going to explore going forward as I continue to try and understand the workings of a segmented racialized labor market that depends for its very existence on the production of hybrid identities in third space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was really fascinating. Really interesting questions, really interesting work, very provocative, beautifully written, by the way. I really like the text itself. No me resta nada más agradecerle muchísimo a Elizabeth. A mí me dejó pensando un montón de cosas y conceptos que para mí también son útiles. Le pido un aplauso virtual, a virtual applause, virtual clapping.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It was really fascinating to me and very useful for my own work. So maybe we can talk about that another time.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, y muchas gracias a los dos Diegos, como siempre, por el apoyo técnico, logístico, y el Departamento de Educación Continua, el Departamento de Ciencias Sociales y Políticas de la Universidad Interamericana, a Igor, de la Autónoma de Yucatán, que también es patrocinador de este evento. Así que...
Gracias, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Elizabeth. Thanks.
Bye-bye.